The standing stones hummed with a frequency that made Kale's teeth ache. He pressed his palm against the weathered granite, feeling vibrations that shouldn't exist in dead rock, and wondered not for the first time if he was chasing madness instead of truth. The circle of megaliths rose from the moorland like broken teeth, each stone carved with symbols that predated every written language he'd studied. Symbols that glowed faintly under moonlight with a pale blue luminescence that no scholar could explain. Cale Brennan had no master to guide him, no academy to fund his research, no lineage of magical talent to smooth his path. He was a self-taught wizard, born to farmers in the borderlands of Silvermoon, who discovered his affinity for magic at 14 when he'd accidentally levitated his mother's entire harvest of turnips into the barn rafters. The local hedge wizard had taught him cantrips and basic spellwork in exchange for labor, but when Cale's questions grew too complex, too obsessive, the old man had sent him away with a warning. Some knowledge isn't meant for those without proper training. You'll hurt yourself, boy, or worse. That had been 8 years ago. Cale was 22 now, lean and weathered from constant travel, his dark hair perpetually disheveled, his robes patched and repatched from sleeping rough. He carried everything he owned in a worn pack, 3 spellbooks he'd copied by hand from borrowed tomes, components scavenged or purchased with coin earned from odd jobs, and a journal filled with observations that would have made academic wizards laugh at his crude theorizing. But Cale had noticed something those learned mages in their comfortable towers had missed, or perhaps deliberately ignored. Magic was changing. Subtle shifts, barely perceptible unless you paid attention. Spells that required slightly more effort to cast than they had a year ago. Enchantments that flickered when they shouldn't. The weave itself seemed to be thinning like fabric worn threadbare by excessive use. Most wizards attributed it to natural fluctuation, if they noticed at all. But Cale had traced the pattern across 3 kingdoms, documenting dozens of sites where the effect was pronounced. And every single location correlated with ancient ruins, marked by the same strange symbols he now studied. The symbols that spoke of something called old mana or ancient mana in the fragmentary texts he'd managed to find. References were scarce, often relegated to footnotes or dismissed as superstition. But Cale had become convinced that old mana was real, that it predated the weave, and that understanding it might explain why magic itself was weakening. A sound disturbed his concentration, hoofbeats on the dirt road that wound through the moor. Cale tensed, one hand moving to his component pouch. Travelers were rare in this desolate region, and those who came usually had ulterior motives. Bandits, mostly, or occasionally mercenaries hired by local lords who didn't appreciate vagabonds camping near cursed sites. But the rider who crested the hill wasn't a bandit. She was a half-elf woman astride a dappled mare, her traveling leathers well-made but practical, a longbow strapped across her back alongside a bedroll. She had the alert posture of someone accustomed to danger, and when she spotted Cale among the stones, her hand didn't move toward a weapon, a good sign. She dismounted 30 feet away, securing her horse before approaching on foot. Smart. The stone's vibrations spooked animals. "You're the one they call the stone listener in the villages," she said without preamble. Her accent marked her as from the southern territories, probably Cormer. The wizard who asks too many questions about old magic. Cale straightened, wary but curious. "I've been called worse." "Who's asking?" "My name is Ileana Swiftbrook. I'm a ranger, tracker, sometimes scout for merchant caravans." She stopped at the edge of the stone circle, her hazel eyes studying him with unsettling intensity. 3 weeks ago, I was hired to guide a group of scholars into the Great Peaks. They were researching ancient dwarven sites. We found something in a sealed chamber, texts and artifacts covered in symbols like those. She gestured at the megaliths. The scholars got excited, started trying to activate something they didn't understand. There was a flash of blue light, a sound like reality tearing, and then she paused, her jaw tightening. Then they were gone. Vanished. Just gone. Cale's pulse quickened. Gone how? Teleported? Disintegrated? I don't know. But the chamber afterward, it was wrong. The air felt thick, like trying to breathe underwater. My spells wouldn't work. Rangers have some druidic magic, she explained, catching his questioning look. Nothing complicated, but useful. Except in that chamber, I couldn't cast even the simplest cantrip. It was like magic itself had been erased from the space. This matched patterns Cale had theorized but never witnessed. And you came looking for me because Because the locals said you're obsessed with old mana. Whatever that is. Because you might actually understand what happened. And because she met his eyes directly. Because I need to know if my colleagues are dead or if there's a chance they're still alive somewhere. If there's a way to bring them back. Kale considered her words, his mind already racing through possibilities. A chamber that negated magic entirely would require enormous power, something beyond normal enchantment. If old mana was involved, if those scholars had accidentally triggered something ancient. I'll help you, he said finally. But I need to be clear about something. I don't have formal training. No academy credentials, no master wizard's recommendation. What I know comes from observation, experimentation, and a lot of reading in libraries that barely tolerated my presence. If you're expecting an expert, I'm expecting someone who gives a damn about finding answers, Liana interrupted. The Mage Guild in Suzail wouldn't even see me. Said that adventure accidents weren't their concern, and I should hire a cleric if I wanted resurrection magic. You're here, studying these stones in the middle of nowhere, with no one paying you or praising you for it. That tells me you actually care about understanding, not just about status. Kale felt something unfamiliar warming in his chest. Recognition. Perhaps validation. Then we should leave at first light. The Grey Peaks are 2 weeks' travel from here. I'll need to gather some supplies from... The stone beneath his hand suddenly blazed with light. Kale jerked back, but the luminescence spread across all the megaliths, the carved symbols igniting in sequence like a message being written in real time. The vibrations intensified, becoming a deep thrumming that resonated in his bones. Liana drew her bow instinctively, though arrows would be useless against whatever was happening. What did you do? She demanded. Nothing. I was just... Kale's protest died as understanding crashed over him. He'd been touching the stone while thinking intensely about old mana, about the Grey Peaks chamber, about finding answers. And somehow, impossibly, the stone circle had responded to his intent. The symbols weren't just decorative. They were a language. A system, and they were trying to communicate. Kale closed his eyes, extending his magical senses the way he'd taught himself, reaching toward the energy emanating from the stones. It felt different from the weave, older, rawer, less structured, like comparing a cultivated garden to a wild forest. The weave was human magic, shaped and organized. This was something that had existed before humanity learned to impose order on chaos. Images flooded his mind. A world without the weave, where magic flowed freely in currents and eddies that followed no predictable pattern. Wizards, no, not wizards, something older, learning to navigate these currents, to draw power directly from the chaotic flow. Then catastrophe, the currents destabilizing, reality itself beginning to unravel. And finally, a great working, the creation of the weave, a structure imposed on chaos to make magic safe and predictable. But the old currents hadn't disappeared. They'd been buried, suppressed, sealed away beneath the weave's ordered framework. And now, after millennia, the seals were failing. Kale opened his eyes, gasping. The stone's glow was fading, returning to their baseline luminescence. Liana stared at him with concern and suspicion in equal measure. You saw something, she said. What was it? The truth about old mana, Kale whispered, his voice shaking. Or at least the beginning of it. Liana, your scholars didn't just find a dwarven ruin. They found a seal, one of the locks that keeps the ancient magic contained. And when they activated it, they broke it open. Then I don't know. But if I'm right, they might have been pulled into the old current itself. Swept away by magic that operates on completely different principles than what we understand. Finding them will require going into that current and learning to navigate it. He looked at her directly. I'll need to learn to use old mana itself. Without a master, without training. Just me. Whatever I can figure out, and the hope that I don't destroy myself in the process. Liana held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'd better get started. Because according to the dwarven calendar markings in that chamber, there are 11 other seals across the continent. And if the scholars activated this one by accident, someone else might activate the others on purpose. Cal felt the weight of what she was suggesting. 11 seals failing. Old mana flooding back into a world that had forgotten how to handle it safely. The potential for catastrophe was enormous. But so was the potential for understanding, for truth. He'd spent 8 years chasing answers with nothing but determination and curiosity to guide him. Now, finally he had a clear direction. The path ahead was dangerous, uncertain, and likely to kill him. Cale Brennan had never felt more alive. "Then we ride at dawn," he said, already planning what research materials he'd need, what experiments he could conduct, what theories he could test. "But first, I need to document everything these stones just showed me. Every detail might matter." As he pulled out his journal and began sketching the symbols with practiced speed, Liana set up camp nearby, her movements efficient and capable. Neither spoke, but a tentative partnership was forming, the self-taught wizard and the practical ranger, united by the need to understand forces that might reshape their entire world. Above them, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, indifferent to mortal concerns. But beneath the earth, in sealed chambers and forgotten ruins, old mana stirred in its ancient prisons, testing the weakening bonds that had contained it for millennia. And somewhere in the Grey Peaks, in a chamber where magic itself had been erased, 3 scholars existed in a state between dimensions, waiting for rescue that might never come, unless one desperate, untrained wizard could master a power that predated civilization itself. The game was beginning. Cale just didn't know all the rules yet. But he would learn, he always did. The journey to the Grey Peaks took 16 days instead of 14. Cale insisted on stopping at every ancient site along their route. A crumbling stone bridge inscribed with faded runes, a dried well whose walls bore the same symbols as the standing stones, even a roadside marker that most travelers passed without a second glance. Each location gave him pieces of the puzzle, fragments of understanding about how old mana had once functioned. Liana bore his obsessive detours with surprising patience, though her anxiety about her missing colleagues simmered beneath the surface. During evening camps, she'd practice her archery with mechanical precision, arrows thudding into distant trees with deadly accuracy, a way to channel worry into productive action. Cale recognized the coping mechanism. He did something similar with his constant note-taking and theorizing. They talked as they traveled, sharing backgrounds that revealed unexpected parallels. Liana had grown up in Cormier's forests, daughter of a human ranger and an elven scout. Like Cale, she'd learned her craft through observation and necessity rather than formal instruction. "My father taught me tracking and survival," she'd explained one evening. "My mother taught me to see the flow of natural magic, how druids sense life energy. But neither could teach me to combine those skills. I had to figure that out myself. Being self-taught has advantages," Cale had replied, carefully mixing components for a spell he was modifying. "No one tells you what's impossible, so you try things academy wizards would never attempt. Of course, sometimes those attempts blow up in your face." Literally. She'd laughed at that, and Cale had felt the partnership solidifying into something closer to friendship. But the companionship couldn't entirely mask his growing unease. With each ancient site they investigated, Cale detected more evidence of the weave's deterioration. Spells took fractionally longer to cast. His prepared magic sometimes flickered, requiring additional concentration to maintain. It was subtle enough that most wizards probably attributed it to fatigue or distraction. But Cale kept meticulous records, and the pattern was undeniable. The weave was weakening, and the rate of decline was accelerating. On their 13th day, they reached the foothills of the Grey Peaks. The mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their slopes covered in pine forests that thinned to bare rock at higher elevations. According to Liana, the chamber was located in an old dwarven outpost about halfway up the eastern face, accessible only by a narrow trail that switchbacked through treacherous terrain. The scholars were mapping trade routes, she explained as they made camp at the trail's base, trying to reconstruct how the dwarves moved goods between kingdoms before the roads collapsed. They thought the outpost would have ledgers, maybe maps. Instead, they found, she gestured helplessly, whatever it was that took them. Cale studied the mountain in the fading light, his mage-trained senses detecting something odd about the rock formations. There was a pattern to them, a deliberate arrangement masked by centuries of erosion and natural growth. "Liana, did the dwarves build this outpost, or did they find it and repurpose it?" She frowned, considering. The scholars argued about that. Dr. Harmon thought it was pure dwarven construction. But Professor Silverthane kept insisting the deepest levels predated dwarven civilization. "Why? Because I think your Professor Silverthane was right. Look at the way the peaks align." He pulled out parchment and began sketching rapidly. "They form the same geometric pattern as the standing stones. This isn't a mountain range shaped by natural geology. It's a monument. A massive ancient structure built around one of the old mana seals. Liana's eyes widened. You're saying the entire mountain is artificial? Not entirely, but the core, the deepest parts? Yes. Some civilization older than dwarves, older than elves. Maybe older than dragons. Built a vault here to contain one of the old magic currents. Then nature grew over it, disguised it, made it look like a natural formation. He met her gaze. Your scholars didn't just stumble into a ruin. They breached a containment facility that's been maintaining itself for thousands of years. They climbed at dawn. The trail was as treacherous as Liana had warned. Sections crumbled away entirely, forcing them to edge along cliff faces where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. Kale, more accustomed to libraries than mountaineering, relied heavily on Liana's guidance and his own levitation cantrip to navigate the worst sections. The outpost entrance appeared around midday, a carved doorway set directly into the mountain face, dwarven runes proclaiming it as Forge Watch Station 7. But beneath the dwarven inscriptions, barely visible, were older symbols. The same language that covered the standing stones. This is it, Liana said, her voice tight. The chamber is 3 levels down. They descended through passages that showed clear signs of both dwarven occupancy and something far older. The upper levels contained rusted mining equipment, collapsed living quarters, evidence of the outpost's original purpose. But the deeper they went, the more the architecture changed from practical dwarven stonework to something more organic. Walls that curved in impossible ways, angles that hurt to look at directly. Kale's magical senses screamed warnings with every step. The weave here was damaged, torn in places, allowing something else to seep through. He could feel it like cold water rising around his ankles, an unfamiliar energy that his wizard training had never prepared him to handle. The chamber itself took his breath away. It was enormous, a spherical cavity carved from living rock, easily 100 feet in diameter. The walls were covered entirely in the ancient symbols, glowing with that pale blue luminescence. But it was the chamber's center that commanded attention, a geometric structure of crystal and stone suspended in mid-air, rotating slowly. Each facet reflecting and refracting light in patterns that suggested mathematical complexity beyond mortal comprehension. And around the structure, the air simply wasn't. Reality had been scooped out like the center of a fruit, leaving a void where magic, both weave-based and old mana, simply ceased to exist. Kale could see the effect's boundary, a perfect sphere perhaps 30 feet in radius, shimmering like heat distortion. That wasn't there before, Liana whispered. When we first entered, the crystal thing was dormant, dark. The scholars touched one of the wall symbols, and it activated. The void appeared, and they were standing too close. It expanded and swallowed them. Kale approached carefully, stopping well short of the void's boundary. He tried casting a simple light cantrip, and the spell formed normally, until the conjured light touched the sphere's edge, where it simply winked out of existence. Not dispelled. Not absorbed. Just deleted from reality. It's exactly what I thought, he breathed. An anti-magical zone, but not like the spell. This completely erases the weave's presence. In that space, magic as we understand it cannot exist. Can you reverse it? Close it? Get my friends back? Kale wanted to say yes, to offer reassurance. But honesty compelled truth. I don't know. This is operating on principles completely outside my training. The weave is like a blanket laid over reality, and this has torn a hole in that blanket. To fix it, I need to understand what made the blanket in the first place, and more importantly, what existed before the blanket was woven. He circled the void carefully, studying the crystal structure at its center. The geometry was precise, mathematical, following patterns that reminded him of spell diagrams, but infinitely more complex. Each rotation of the structure seemed to maintain the void, drawing power from somewhere to sustain the anti-magical effect. There, he said suddenly, pointing. See how the lowest facet pulses slightly out of sync with the others? That's the anchor point. The scholars must have activated that specific symbol on the wall, creating a resonance that powered up the whole system. So we deactivate it the same way? Maybe, if I can figure out which symbol to touch without making things worse. This could be like defusing an explosive. One wrong move and the whole mountain comes down on our heads. He pulled out his journal, comparing the wall symbols to his sketches from the standing stones. There had to be a pattern, a logic to the arrangement. Hours passed. Kale worked with obsessive focus, mapping every symbol, testing theories, discarding failed hypotheses. Liana kept watch, occasionally offering observations that surprised him with their insight. Her ranger training gave her a different perspective on pattern recognition, seeing arrangements in the symbols that echoed natural formations. "These three here," she said, indicating a cluster near the chamber's entrance. "They're positioned like a wolf pack's tracks when they're herding prey." Leading somewhere, Kale followed the implied direction, and suddenly the pattern clicked. It's a sequence. Not random placement, but a path. Like instructions written in spatial relationships rather than words. He traced the route with his finger, symbol to symbol, each one leading to the next through subtle alignments. The path ended at a symbol directly opposite the one the scholars had activated, a mirror image, but inverted. "This might close it," Kale said. "Or it might collapse the entire containment system and flood this chamber with raw old mana. I'm guessing, Liana. I want to be completely honest about that. I'm making educated guesses based on incomplete information." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I trust your guesses more than most people's certainties." "Do it." Kyle approached the symbol, his hand trembling slightly. This was the moment where self-teaching either proved sufficient or catastrophically inadequate. No master to consult, no academy texts to reference, just his own observations and desperate hope. He pressed his palm against the symbol. The chamber exploded with sound and light. The crystal structure spun faster, its facets blazing with energy. The void sphere began to contract, collapsing inward, but not smoothly. It pulsed erratically, expanding and contracting, and at its edge Kale could see shapes forming. Human shapes. Three figures, translucent and flickering, caught between existence and non-existence. "The scholars!" Liana shouted over the noise. "They're still there, still alive." But the void wasn't releasing them. Instead, it was pulling them deeper, drawing them toward the crystal structure's core where they'd be trapped forever. Kale needed to stabilize the collapse, give the scholars time to escape before the void closed completely. He had seconds to make a decision that required knowledge he didn't possess. So he did what self-taught wizards do when formal education fails. He improvised. Kale thrust both hands toward the void and began casting. Not a single spell, but multiple cantrips woven together in ways the Academy would call impossible. Light and prestidigitation and mage hand, simple magics combined into a framework that might interact with the void's boundary. He wasn't trying to enter the anti-magical zone. He was using it, shaping the weave around its edge like clay around a sculptor's form. The improvised spell construct touched the void's boundary and, miraculously, held. Kale felt the strain immediately, his concentration stretched to breaking as he maintained something that should have torn apart instantly. Sweat poured down his face. His hands shook with effort. "Grab them," he gasped to Liana. "I can't hold this long." Liana didn't hesitate. She ran forward, ducking beneath Kale's outstretched arms, and plunged into the void's edge where it was weakened by his spell. For a terrifying instant, she flickered and began to fade, but then her hand closed on one of the translucent figures and she yanked backward with all her strength. The figure solidified, a middle-aged human man in scholar's robes, gasping and confused. Liana dragged him clear and dove back in. Twice more she repeated the rescue, each time barely pulling free before Kale's concentration failed. When the third scholar was clear, Kale released his spell with a cry of exhaustion. The void snapped shut like a closing fist, the crystal structure's rotation slowing, its glow fading to dormancy. And in that moment, as the chamber settled back to quiescence, Kale felt it, a pulse of old mana escaping the damaged seal, flowing past him like a cold river. It was nothing like the weave's structured power. It was raw, chaotic, instinctive. It responded not to carefully pronounced spells, but to sheer will and emotional intent. Without thinking, purely on instinct, Kale reached out and touched it. Power flooded through him. Not the controlled, measured flow of weave magic, but a torrent of pure potential that threatened to burn him from the inside out. He tried to release it, to let go, but the old mana had recognized something in him, his desperate need to understand, his years of teaching himself through observation, and it responded by showing him. Visions crashed through his mind, ancient wizards, pre-weave practitioners who shaped reality through force of will alone. Catastrophes when that will faltered, when emotional instability caused magic to rampage unchecked. The decision to create the weave, to sacrifice raw power for safety and predictability. And finally, the sealing of old mana, locking it away where it couldn't threaten the new order. But the seals were failing. Not by accident, but by design. They'd been built to last millennia, not forever. Someone, long ago, had known they would eventually weaken and had left the symbols, the markers, the knowledge scattered across the world for those curious enough to find it. They'd left a message for future generations. Learn to use old mana before it breaks free on its own. Master it, or it will destroy everything. Kale released his connection with a gasp, collapsing to his knees. The chamber spun around him. His entire body tingled with residual energy. Liana was at his side instantly. "Are you all right? What happened?" Cal struggled to find words. "I touched it. The old mana, it showed me..." "Liana, we don't have much time. The seals aren't breaking randomly. They're failing because they're reaching the end of their designed lifespan. And when they all fail, when all 11 seals open at once, old mana will flood back into the world. Into a civilization that has no idea how to handle it safely." He looked up at her, his eyes wide with the weight of revelation. Someone has to learn to use it, to teach others, to prepare the world for what's coming. And I think he laughed bitterly at the absurdity. I think that someone is supposed to be me. The untrained, self-taught wizard with no master and no credentials. Because everyone with proper training is too invested in the weave to see the truth. Behind them, the 3 rescued scholars were regaining their bearings, confused and traumatized but alive. They would need care, debriefing, probably months of recovery from their ordeal between dimensions. But Kale's journey was just beginning. He'd come to the Grey Peaks seeking answers about old mana, and he'd found them, along with a responsibility he'd never asked for and a task that seemed impossible. Without master or guidance, he would have to learn to wield a power that had nearly destroyed the world once before. The truth about old mana was no longer a mystery. Now came the hard part, deciding what to do with that knowledge. The village of Thornhaven lay 3 days south of the Grey Peaks. A modest collection of stone cottages and timber halls where foresters and miners made their living from the mountain's bounty. It was the nearest settlement with a proper healer, and Dr. Harmond, the eldest of the rescued scholars, needed more care than Liana's field medicine could provide. The old man had emerged from the void with frost-white hair and trembling hands, muttering about spaces between spaces and time that doesn't flow. His companions fared better. Professor Silverthane, a dwarf woman with silver-shot beard and keen eyes, recovered quickly once she'd had food and rest. The third scholar, a young gnome named Tiberius Quickwit, seemed almost energized by the experience, filling page after page of his notebook with observations about the phenomenological experience of existing in a null-state magical void. They'd taken rooms at Thornhaven's only inn, a place called the Copper Kettle that smelled of pine smoke and rabbit stew. Kale sat in the common room, surrounded by borrowed books and his own accumulated notes, trying to synthesize everything he'd learned into something actionable. The problem seemed insurmountable from every angle he examined it. "You're overthinking," Professor Silverthane said, settling into the chair across from him with a mug of ale. "A common flaw in self-taught practitioners. No one to tell you when to stop researching and start doing." Cal looked up, surprised. The dwarf had been cordial but distant since her rescue, more concerned with recording their experience than engaging with their rescuer. "I'm trying to understand the mechanics before I experiment further." "Old mana is dangerous. All magic is dangerous," she interrupted. "The weave didn't make magic safe. It just made it predictable. There's a difference." She took a long drink, studying him over the rim of her mug. "Liana told me what you did. How you improvised a spell construct to stabilize the void's collapse. Used weave magic to manipulate the boundary of an anti-magical zone. Do you understand how impossible that should have been?" "It worked," Kale said simply. "Because you didn't know it was impossible." "That's the advantage of having no master. No one told you the rules you were breaking." She leaned forward. "I've spent 40 years studying ancient magical systems. I have 3 degrees from the College of Luminous Arcana, tenure at 2 universities, and recognition as an expert in pre-weave civilizations. And you know what all that training taught me? That there are correct ways to do magic and incorrect ways. And the incorrect ways lead to disaster. Kyle waited, sensing she was building toward a point. But here's the problem, Silverthane continued. The correct ways are all based on the weave. Every theory, every principle, every safety guideline assumes the weave's existence. So when we encountered something that predated the weave, something that operated on completely different principles, all my expertise was worse than useless. It was actively misleading. I approached Old Mana with weave-trained assumptions and nearly got 3 people killed. She set down her mug, her expression serious. You approached it with curiosity and observation. No preconceptions, no rigid framework. Just, here's a phenomenon I don't understand. Let me figure it out. That flexibility saved us, Kale. And it's exactly what you'll need if you're going to master Old Mana before the seals fail completely. You believe me then? About the seals being designed to fail? Tiberius and I compared notes. The temporal anomalies we experienced in the void, the geometric precision of the containment structure, it all points to deliberate engineering, not natural formation. Someone built those seals knowing they'd degrade over time, which means they expected future generations to discover them, study them, eventually need to manage the transition when Old Mana returned. She smiled grimly. The question is whether they overestimated our intelligence or underestimated our attachment to comfortable ignorance. Kale felt a surge of relief at finding an ally who understood. Then you'll help? With the research, the experimentation? I can't, not directly. Silverthane's expression turned regretful. I'm too set in my ways, too bound by academic training. I'd slow you down, second-guess every unorthodox approach. But I can provide resources, access to archives I'm familiar with, introductions to collectors who might have relevant texts, funding for your travels. She pulled a sealed letter from her robes. This is a letter of credit, good at any Cormarian bank. 10,000 gold pieces. Use it for research, bribes, whatever you need. Kale stared at the letter, stunned. I can't accept. You can and you will. Dr. Harmon and I pooled our savings. Consider it payment for our rescue and an investment in possibly saving the world. She stood, preparing to leave, then paused. One more thing. When you experiment with Old Mana, document everything. Every success, every failure, especially every mistake. You're charting unknown territory. Kale, your notes might be the only map future practitioners have. She left him there, holding a fortune in funding and the weight of responsibility that came with it. Over the next week, Kale established a routine. Mornings were spent in meditation, trying to sense Old Mana the way he'd learned to sense the weave. It was difficult. Old Mana didn't flow in predictable currents like the weave. It pooled in certain places, thin in others, following rules he didn't yet understand. But gradually, he developed a feel for it. Recognizing its presence by the way reality seemed less rigid around it, more responsive to will and emotion. Afternoons were for experimentation. He started simple, trying to move small objects using Old Mana instead of weave-based Mage Hand. The results were erratic. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes objects flew with excessive force, shattering against walls. Once, a pebble he was trying to levitate simply vanished, reappearing 3 days later in his boot. The difference, he recorded in his journal, seems to be intent versus instruction. Weave magic requires precise verbal and somatic components. You're essentially programming reality with specific commands. Old Mana responds to direct will, but it interprets that will emotionally rather than logically. When I wanted the pebble to rise while feeling frustrated, it launched like a sling bullet. When I calmly intended it to float, it responded gently. The emotional state of the caster matters as much as the desired outcome. This was both promising and terrifying. Emotional control had never been Kale's strong suit. His passion for knowledge often bordered on obsession. His frustration at obstacles frequently boiled over into anger. Using magic that amplified those emotions seemed like a recipe for disaster. But he had no choice. The seals wouldn't wait for him to achieve perfect emotional balance. Liana proved invaluable during this period. Her ranger training included meditation techniques for maintaining calm during high-stress situations, and she taught Kale breathing exercises that helped center his thoughts. They'd become genuine friends, united by shared purpose and mutual respect for each other's unconventional expertise. You're overthinking again, she'd say when Kale got too deep into theoretical spirals, or trust your instincts. They've gotten you this far. It was during the second week that things went catastrophically wrong. Kale had been practicing increasingly complex manipulations, creating light using old mana, generating heat, attempting to replicate basic weave spells through pure will. He felt confident, perhaps overconfident in his growing understanding. So when he decided to try something more ambitious, he didn't take proper precautions. He attempted to heal a minor cut on his hand using old mana. Healing was already complex magic under the weave, requiring understanding of biology and vital energies. Using old mana should have made it simpler. Just will the wound to close. Let emotion guide reality toward the desired state. Kale focused intensely, pouring his will into the cut, demanding that flesh knit and blood flow cease. The wound did close, but it didn't stop there. Flesh continued to grow, spreading across his palm like a cancer, warping bone and muscle as it went. Kale screamed, trying to stop the process, but his panicked attempts only made it worse. His entire hand was transforming, becoming something monstrous and wrong. Liana burst into the room at his scream, assessed the situation in an instant, and did the only thing that made sense. She grabbed Kale's wrist and plunged his hand into the water bucket they kept for washing, shocking him out of his focused state. The transformation stopped immediately, but the damage was done. Kale's hand was a twisted mass of scar tissue and malformed fingers, barely functional. "Don't move," Liana commanded. She ran from the room and returned minutes later with the village's healer. A middle-aged human woman named Sister Marta. The healer took one look at Kale's hand and blanched. "What kind of curse is this?" "Magical accident," Liana said tersely. "Can you reverse it?" Sister Marta examined the hand carefully, then began casting diagnostic spells. "The damage is organic, not imposed from outside but grown from within. I can try restoration magic, but if this was caused by corrupted healing, my spells might make it worse." She looked at Kale. "What exactly did you do?" Kale, pale and shaking from pain and shock, explained haltingly. Sister Marta listened with growing concern. "I've never heard of magic that responds to emotion instead of incantation," she admitted. "My healing is weave-based, structured, and safe. If I cast it on tissue that's been altered by this old mana, the interaction could be unpredictable." "Then what do we do?" Liana demanded. Kale forced himself to think through the pain. "I did this with old mana. Maybe I can undo it the same way. I just need to understand what I did wrong first." He looked at his ruined hand, analyzing it with the same obsessive attention he'd given to every mystery in his life. "I wanted the wound to heal, but I didn't specify boundaries. I told reality, close this wound, without defining what this was or when to stop. Old mana took the broadest interpretation. Heal all damage, past and present, real and imagined, and keep healing indefinitely. So the solution is to be more specific?" Sister Marta asked. "The solution is to understand that old mana doesn't think linguistically. It's not about being specific in words. It's about being precise in conception. I need to hold a perfect mental image of what my hand should be, with absolute clarity, no ambiguity." He took a shaking breath. "And I need to do it while in incredible pain and fighting the fear that I'll make things worse." "You can't do that alone," Liana said firmly. "You need someone to anchor you, keep you focused." "I'll help," Sister Marta said, surprising them both. "I may not understand your old mana, but I understand healing. I can describe what healthy tissue should look like, help you visualize the correct state. And if things go wrong, I'll be here to intervene with conventional magic." It took 3 hours. 3 agonizing hours of Kale attempting to impose his will on the warped flesh while Sister Marta guided his visualization, and Liana kept him calm through breathing exercises. Twice he nearly lost focus. Once, the transformation started accelerating again before he regained control. But gradually, painfully, the hand returned to normal. Scar tissue smoothed, bones straightened, muscle reknit properly. When it was done, Kale collapsed in exhaustion, his hand whole but trembling. "That," he gasped, "was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced." "Good," Sister Marta said bluntly. "Fear will make you cautious. Caution will keep you alive. The power you're playing with isn't a tool, young man. It's a force of nature. Respect it or it will destroy you." After she left, Kale sat in silence, staring at his restored hand. Liana sat beside him, not speaking, just present. "I could have died," he said finally. "One wrong thought, one moment of lost concentration, and I'd have transformed into something too twisted to survive. But you didn't. You understood the problem, adapted, and fixed it." That's what you do, Kale. That's who you are. Is it enough, though? The seals are failing across the continent. When old mana floods back, it won't just be me experimenting in controlled conditions. It'll be thousands of wizards trying to use power they don't understand, making the same mistakes I just made, but without the knowledge to fix them. People will die. Cities could be destroyed. Liana was quiet for a moment, then spoke with characteristic directness. Then you need to make sure you survive long enough to teach them better. You need to document your mistakes so others don't repeat them. And you need to find the remaining seals before they fail uncontrolled, so you can manage their opening rather than just react to catastrophe. Kale looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. You're staying with me? Even knowing how dangerous this is? Someone has to keep you from overthinking yourself into paralysis. Might as well be me. She smiled slightly. Besides, I'm curious now. You've shown me that reality is stranger than I imagined. I want to see where this goes. That night, Kale made a decision. He couldn't master old mana in isolation, couldn't prepare the world through research alone. He needed to find the other seals, study each one, understand how they were failing and potentially how to repair or safely dismantle them. It would mean traveling across Faerun, visiting dangerous ruins, risking his life repeatedly. But the alternative, waiting for catastrophe, was unacceptable. Without master, without formal training, with nothing but his observations and growing understanding, Kale Brennan would chart the return of old mana. He'd document the truth for those who came after, build the foundation of a new magical tradition based on will and emotional clarity rather than rigid incantation. And maybe, if he was very lucky and very careful, he'd survive long enough to see it through. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since touching that first standing stone, Kale felt certain of his path. The truth about old mana was revealing itself, one dangerous experiment at a time. And he would see it through to the end. 6 months had passed since Thornhaven. 6 months of travel, research, and carefully controlled experiments that pushed Kale to the limits of his understanding and endurance. He and Liana had visited 4 more seal sites, each one teaching him something new about how old mana functioned and how the ancient builders had contained it. Now they stood before the last seal, the 11th and final containment structure. It wasn't hidden in a mountain or buried beneath ruins. It stood in the open, in a place called the Nexus Plane, a flat expanse of crystallized stone that stretched for miles, utterly barren of life. Local legends called it cursed ground, a place where reality itself had been burned away by some ancient catastrophe. Kale now understood the truth. This was Ground Zero, the epicenter where old mana had once nearly destroyed the world before the Weave's creation. The seal here was enormous, a tower of interlocking crystal spires that rose hundreds of feet into the air, humming with barely contained energy. Unlike the other seals, which were degrading slowly, this one was actively failing. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, and pulses of blue light escaped with increasing frequency. It's going to break soon, Kale said quietly. Days, maybe hours. When it does, all the old mana it's been containing will flood out at once. Can you stop it? Liana asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. No, but I might be able to redirect it. Channel the release instead of letting it explode unchecked. He pulled out his journal, now filled with months of observations and calculations. Every seal I've studied follows the same basic principles: containment through geometric harmony, balance through opposing forces. This one is the master seal, the anchor point that stabilizes all the others. When it fails, the entire network collapses and old mana returns to the world. Then we're out of time. We've been out of time since the day I touched that first standing stone. The difference is now I understand what needs to happen. Kale looked at her seriously. Liana, you should leave. Go back to civilization, warn people to prepare for magical disruptions. What I'm about to attempt could kill me, and there's no reason for you to die too. She crossed her arms. We've had this argument at every seal. The answer hasn't changed. I'm staying. This is different. It's always different. And I'm always staying. She smiled slightly. Someone has to document your success or spectacular failure. Might as well be someone who knows you well enough to describe your overthinking process accurately. Despite the gravity of the situation, Kale laughed. Over 6 months, Liana had become more than a companion or friend. She'd become his anchor to practical reality. The person who kept him grounded when theoretical obsession threatened to consume him. All right? he said. Then here's the plan. I'm going to make direct contact with the seal, establish a connection with the old mana it's containing. Then I'll guide it, shape its release so it disperses gradually instead of erupting all at once. In theory, this will prevent catastrophic reality distortion and give the world time to adapt. And in practice? In practice, I'll be channeling more old mana than I've ever touched, while maintaining perfect emotional control and absolute clarity of purpose, for however long it takes to empty the seal completely. If my focus wavers even slightly, the feedback could destroy my mind or transform my body into something non-viable. He said it matter-of-factly, the same tone he'd used to describe a spell formula. Kyle, yes? Don't die. I'd find it extremely inconvenient. He smiled at her attempt to lighten the mood. I'll do my best. Kyle approached the seal, feeling its power resonating in his bones. This close, he could sense the vast ocean of old mana contained within millennia of accumulated magical force, raw and primal, waiting to break free. It terrified him. It also called to something deep in his nature, the same curiosity that had driven him to ask forbidden questions, to teach himself what no academy would show him. He placed both hands on the crystal surface. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, Kale existed in two places at once, physically present on the Nexus plane and simultaneously perceiving the vast network of seals across the continent, all connected through channels of contained old mana. He could feel each seal's status, sense their structural integrity degrading in real time. And he could feel the builder's intent, the ancient purpose encoded into the seal's very construction. They'd known this moment would come. They designed the seals not to contain old mana forever, but to preserve it safely until a civilization arose that was ready to reclaim it. Ready to learn, to adapt, to transcend the limitations of weave-based magic while avoiding the catastrophes of the pre-weave era. The seals were a gift, not a prison. A carefully managed transition, not a permanent solution. Kale understood, finally, what he needed to do. He stopped trying to contain the old mana. Instead, he opened himself to it completely, becoming a conduit rather than a barrier. The power flooded through him, and instead of fighting it, he shaped it. Not with rigid control, but with gentle guidance. The way a river guide directs water without trying to stop its flow. The master seal began to glow, brighter and brighter, as old mana flowed through Kale and out into the world. But it didn't erupt violently. Instead, it dispersed in carefully controlled waves, spreading across the continent along ley lines that had been prepared millennia ago for exactly this purpose. Kale could sense wizards across Faerun reacting to the change. Some panicked as their weave-based spells flickered and transformed. Others, more attuned to magical currents, felt the new power and tentatively reached for it. A few, those like Kale who'd been asking forbidden questions, recognized what was happening and began to experiment, their natural curiosity overcoming fear. The process took hours. Kale existed in a state of hyperfocus. His consciousness expanded across multiple planes of awareness, guiding old mana's return while preventing catastrophic spikes in magical energy. Distantly, he was aware of Liana standing guard, her bow ready to defend him from any threats while he was vulnerable. But mostly, he was aware of the magic itself, its nature, its patterns, its fundamental difference from the weave. Old mana responded to will, yes, but not just any will. It responded to authentic will, to desires and intentions that came from the deepest parts of consciousness. You couldn't lie to old mana, couldn't pretend to want something you didn't truly desire. It saw through deception, through self-delusion, through the masks people wore even to themselves. This, Kale realized, was why the ancient civilization had nearly destroyed itself. Not because old mana was inherently dangerous, but because it forced practitioners to confront their own natures, without filter. Ambitious people found their ambition amplified to destructive levels. Fearful people manifested their fears into reality. Angry people became walking catastrophes. But those who achieved genuine self-knowledge, who understood their own motivations and emotions with perfect clarity, they could wield old mana with precision and power that made weave magic look crude by comparison. The weave had been created not to make magic safe, but to make it accessible to people who hadn't achieved that level of self-awareness. It was a framework that allowed imperfect beings to use magic without perfect wisdom. Now both systems would exist in parallel. The weave would remain for those who preferred structure and predictability. But old mana would be available for those willing to do the difficult work of understanding themselves, of achieving the emotional clarity required to wield power through pure will. The Master Seal's glow began to fade. The reservoir of old mana was depleting, flowing out into the world where it would settle into natural patterns, pooling in certain locations, creating new sources of power for future generations to discover and study. Kale felt the last of it drain through him, and then the connection severed. He collapsed, his body no longer sustained by the power flowing through it. Liana caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him carefully to the crystallized stone. "Is it done?" she asked urgently. "It's done," Kale whispered, his voice hoarse. "The seals are empty. Old mana has returned to the world. Now we see if I've helped or just accelerated catastrophe." For 3 days, Kale remained at the Nexus plane, too exhausted to travel. During that time, reports began to filter in from across Faerun, brought by magical communication and mundane messengers alike. The news was mixed. In some regions, the transition had been smooth. Wizards adapted quickly, learning to blend weave and old mana in their casting, creating hybrid magical effects never before possible. Magical academies reported students spontaneously developing new abilities, pushing boundaries that had seemed absolute. In other areas, chaos reigned. Wizards who'd relied entirely on memorized spells found their magic unreliable, flickering between weave and old mana unpredictably. Some communities experienced surges of wild magic as old mana pooled in locations without proper management. 3 villages reported reality distortions, similar to what Kale had caused when he'd botched healing his hand. Localized catastrophes that required emergency intervention, but no worldwide apocalypse. No collapse of civilization. The careful, controlled release had worked. Professor Silverthane arrived on the 4th day, teleporting directly to their camp with news from the academic community. "You're being called both savior and catastrophe causer, depending on who's asked," she reported. "The mage guilds are in an uproar. Half want to give you a medal, half want you arrested for reckless endangerment of reality." Kale laughed weakly. "Sounds about right. The important thing is that people are talking about it, asking questions. Some of the brighter academy students are already theorizing about old mana's mechanics. Building on your documented observations." She pulled out a familiar journal, Kale's, or rather a copy of it. "I took the liberty of having your research duplicated and distributed to major libraries. You'll be furious about the copyright infringement, but consider it payment for making me reconsider 40 years of assumed knowledge." "I don't care about credit," Kale said honestly. "I just wanted to understand, I know. That's what makes you dangerous. You seek truth for its own sake, regardless of how it disrupts comfortable lies." She studied him seriously. "What will you do now? The seals are empty, old mana is back in the world. Your quest is complete." Kale looked at Liana, who'd been listening quietly. Then he looked out across the Nexus plane, feeling the currents of old mana flowing through reality like underground rivers finally breaking to the surface. "My quest isn't complete," he said. "It's just beginning. People need to learn to use old mana safely. They need teachers who understand both its power and its dangers. And since I'm one of the few who's actually studied it systematically," he shrugged, "I guess I need to become what I never had, a master for those seeking to learn." "A school?" Professor Silverthane asked, eyebrows raising. "Not a formal academy. Those create rigid thinking. But maybe a network, a gathering place for self-taught practitioners and curious minds. Somewhere people can experiment safely, share discoveries, learn from each other's mistakes." He smiled slightly. "A place where asking forbidden questions is encouraged instead of punished." Liana spoke up for the first time. "You'll need security. Someone to keep enthusiastic students from accidentally transforming themselves into newts." "Are you volunteering?" "Someone has to. I've gotten used to keeping you alive. Might as well extend that service to your future students." Professor Silverthane nodded approvingly. "I can provide funding and academic connections." Dr. Harmond has also expressed interest. He's recovered Nausli and is eager to study old mana's effects on temporal perception. Tiberius has already started writing what he calls a comprehensive primer on non-weave magical practices. She smiled. "You won't be alone in this, Kale. You've inspired more people than you realize." 3 months later, Kale stood in the courtyard of what would become the Nexus Academy, though he refused to call it an academy. The gathering, he'd named it instead, A place where practitioners of all backgrounds could come together to explore magic without preconception or prejudice. The location was perfect, close enough to the old master seal to access strong old mana currents, remote enough to prevent accidents from affecting populated areas. Buildings were still under construction, but the first students had already arrived, a mix of self-taught wizards like Kale, academy dropouts who'd been frustrated by rigid teaching methods, and even a few established mages willing to unlearn their assumptions and start fresh. Liana managed security and logistics with characteristic efficiency. Professor Silverthane served as liaison to the wider academic community, defending the gathering from critics while recruiting open-minded scholars. And Kale taught what he'd learned through trial and error, documented mistakes alongside successes, and encouraged his students to ask the questions no one else would. The key to old mana, he told his first class, showing them his scarred hand as an object lesson, is perfect self-knowledge. You cannot lie to it, cannot deceive it with words or gestures. It sees your true intent, your authentic desires, and manifests them into reality. This makes it incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous, because most of us lie to ourselves constantly. He demonstrated, levitating a stone with old mana while explaining his emotional state, his precise intention, the clarity of purpose required. Then he had students attempt the same thing, coaching them through the self-examination necessary to achieve results. Some succeeded immediately, others struggled for weeks. A few gave up and returned to weave-based magic, which was fine. Kale never forced anyone to pursue old mana if it didn't suit their nature. But those who persisted, who did the difficult work of understanding themselves, they achieved things the weave had never allowed. They combined elements in ways that should have been impossible, bent reality through sheer force of clarified will, created entirely new forms of magic that blurred the line between art and science. And they documented everything, just as Kale had taught them. Every experiment, every failure, every discovery went into the gathering's growing library, a resource that would outlive them all, guiding future practitioners toward mastery without catastrophe. Word spread. More students arrived. Some established wizards visited out of curiosity and stayed when they realized what was being discovered. Even a few clerics came, intrigued by the connections between old mana and divine magic, both of which responded to belief and intent rather than rigid formulation. The gathering grew into something Kale had never imagined, not a school, but a movement. A fundamental shift in how magic was understood and practiced. And at its center stood a young man who'd learned everything through observation and experimentation, who'd had no master to guide him, who discovered truth through stubborn curiosity and willingness to risk failure. 5 years after touching the standing stones in the moorland, Kale Brennan sat in his study at the gathering, writing the final entry in his personal journal. Tomorrow, he'd begin work on a comprehensive text. The Nature of Old Mana, a self-taught wizard's guide to authentic magic, but tonight was for reflection. I set out to understand where magic came from, he wrote. I found the answer, but more importantly, I learned that understanding isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning. Old mana is back in the world, and with it comes both incredible possibility and terrible danger. The question now isn't, what is old mana, but what will we do with it? I don't know the answer yet. But I know how to find out, through careful observation, honest experimentation, and willingness to learn from failure. The same methods that brought me this far, without master, without formal training, I've mapped a territory that was lost for millennia. Others will go further than I ever could. They'll discover things I can't imagine, push boundaries I haven't conceived. And when they do, I'll be here to learn from them, because the greatest lesson of being self-taught is this. Teaching and learning are the same process, just viewed from different angles. The truth about old mana isn't a single revelation. It's an ongoing discovery, a conversation between curiosity and reality that never truly ends. And I intend to participate in that conversation for as long as I'm able. He set down his pen and looked out the window at the gathering's courtyard, where students practiced under moonlight their magic weave. And old mana both, painting the darkness with light and possibility. Kale smiled. The journey that had begun with a simple question, where does magic come from, had led him to places he'd never imagined. It had cost him comfort, certainty, nearly his life on multiple occasions. But it had given him purpose, understanding, and a community of fellow seekers who valued truth over tradition. He'd been alone when he started, without master or support, armed only with curiosity and determination. He wasn't alone anymore. And the truth about old mana, that ancient force he'd helped reintroduce to the world, continued to unfold. One carefully documented experiment, one honest self-examination, one forbidden question at a time. 20 years had passed since Cale Brennan first touched the standing stones in the moorland. The gathering had evolved beyond anything its founder could have anticipated. What began as a modest collection of buildings in the Nexus Plane had grown into a sprawling campus that housed over 300 permanent residents, students, teachers, researchers, and visiting scholars from across Farin. But more importantly, satellite locations had emerged in 17 cities, each one serving as a hub for practitioners learning to blend weave magic with old mana techniques. Cale stood in the original courtyard, now much expanded, watching a demonstration by one of his advanced students. The young woman, a tiefling named Sarah, who'd arrived 5 years ago with raw talent and no formal education, was performing what she called harmonic casting, simultaneously weaving weave-based evocation with old mana manipulation to create a flame that burned in colors that shouldn't exist, responding to her emotional state while maintaining perfect stability. It was beautiful. It was also something Cale had once thought impossible. "You taught her well," Liana said, appearing at his elbow with the silent grace that still occasionally startled him after 2 decades of friendship. She'd gained a few streaks of gray in her dark hair, and her face bore the weathering of someone who'd spent years outdoors, but her eyes remained as sharp as ever. "I taught her the basics," Cal corrected. "She discovered the rest herself." "That's how it should work," Liana smiled knowingly. At 42, Cale had finally learned to accept that his students might surpass him. Not just accept it, but encourage it actively. The self-taught wizard who'd once desperately sought answers from anyone who might provide them had become comfortable saying, "I don't know, but let's find out together." "Professor Silverthane sent word," Liana said, handing him a sealed letter. "The Conclave of Mages has finally agreed to formally recognize old mana techniques in their curriculum. It only took them 20 years of watching our success." Cale opened the letter, scanning its contents with a mix of satisfaction and irony. The same academic institutions that had once ignored or mocked his research now wanted to incorporate it into their official teachings. They were even offering him a position, Grand Master of Integrated Magical Studies, with tenure, full academic honors, and a salary that made him laugh out loud. "Are you going to accept?" Liana asked. "No. That life would kill me. All those committees, all that bureaucracy," he shook his head. "But I'll send them copies of our research, free of charge. If they want to teach old mana their way, that's their choice. We'll keep teaching it ours." "Still refusing to charge tuition?" "Knowledge shouldn't have a price tag. We accept donations, we take commissions for magical services, we sell our published research to those who can afford it. But no one gets turned away from learning because they're poor." He'd made that rule on the gathering's first day and never wavered from it. Too many self-taught practitioners had been denied education because they lacked gold or connections. Cale refused to perpetuate that barrier. They walked together through the campus, past workshops where students experimented under careful supervision, libraries filled with documented discoveries, meditation gardens where practitioners worked on the self-knowledge required for old mana mastery. The gathering hummed with productive energy, a place where curiosity was celebrated rather than constrained. "Tiberius finished his latest edition," Liana mentioned. "The comprehensive primer is up to volume 7 now. He's convinced he'll need at least 10 more to cover everything discovered in the last 5 years alone." Cale chuckled. The enthusiastic gnome had indeed written his primer, which had become the standard reference text for old mana practitioners worldwide. Each volume was meticulously researched, filled with practical exercises and warnings learned from painful experience. Cale had contributed heavily to the first 3 volumes before deciding his time was better spent teaching directly. They reached Cale's private workshop, the one place in the gathering where he still conducted personal research. Inside, his current project waited, an attempt to create a hybrid magical focus that could channel both weave and old mana simultaneously, switching between them seamlessly based on the caster's needs. It wasn't going well. The prototype had exploded twice, and the 3rd iteration showed promising results before inexplicably turning his desk into a flowering cherry tree. The tree remained, a reminder that even after 20 years, old mana could still surprise him. "Have you given any thought to succession?" Liana asked carefully. You're not old, but you're not young either. Someone should know how you want the gathering to continue if something happens to you. Kale had been avoiding this question for years, but Liana's directness demanded honesty. I don't want a single successor. That creates the same master-student hierarchy that limited magical progress for centuries. The gathering should be led by a council of practitioners, rotating positions, making decisions collectively. He paused. Though I'd want you on that council. You understand what we're trying to do here better than anyone. I'm not a mage. You don't need to be. We need people who understand that magic serves life, not the other way around. Your ranger perspective has kept us grounded when theoretical obsession threatened to pull us into dangerous territory. He met her eyes. You've been my anchor for 20 years, Liana. You've saved my life more times than I can count. Not just from external threats, but from my own tendency to push too hard, question too deeply, risk too much. I trust your judgment more than my own sometimes. She looked away, but he caught the pleased smile before she hit it. Flatterer, truth-teller. There's a difference. A commotion outside drew their attention. Excited voices, running footsteps. Kale and Liana emerged to find students gathered around a newcomer, a young half-orc woman who looked exhausted from travel. Her robes marked with symbols Kale recognized from his old research. Are you Kale Brennan? She asked breathlessly when she spotted him. The one who opened the seals? I am. What's wrong? I'm from the far eastern territories beyond the Hordlands. We've discovered something, a structure buried beneath the desert that matches your descriptions of the seal sites. But it's different. Older, and it's not containing old mana? She paused, gathering courage. We think it's containing something else. Something that predates even old mana. The courtyard went silent. Kale felt a familiar sensation, the pull of curiosity, the hunger to understand, the irresistible draw of a new mystery. 20 years ago, he would have immediately grabbed his pack and left to investigate. Now, older and marginally wiser, he considered more carefully. Tell me everything you know, he said, leading her toward the research hall. And then we'll decide how to proceed. Carefully, methodically, with proper preparation and safety protocols. Liana fell into step beside him, her hand resting casually on her bow. Here we go again. You don't have to come. This could be dangerous. It's always dangerous, and I'm always coming. Some patterns don't change, Kale. He smiled, grateful beyond words for her steady presence. Then he turned his attention to the half-orc woman, already asking questions, already piecing together the puzzle, already being drawn into another mystery that would probably consume months or years of his life. Because that was who Kale Brennan was, a seeker of truth, a asker of forbidden questions. A wizard who'd learned everything through observation and determination rather than formal instruction. The boy from a farming family who'd levitated turnips had become a man who'd reshaped magical practice across an entire continent. But he'd never stopped being fundamentally the same person, curious, persistent, willing to risk everything for understanding. The gathering would continue whether he was here or exploring ancient ruins and distant deserts. He'd built something larger than himself. Created a community that valued discovery over dogma, question over certainty. His students would teach the next generation. Who would teach the generation after that? Passing forward not just knowledge, but the method, the willingness to learn through doing, to embrace failure as instruction, to trust observation over assumption. That legacy would outlive him by centuries. But for now, there was a new mystery to solve, a new discovery waiting to be made. And Kale Brennan, self-taught wizard and master of old mana, was ready to begin again. 15 years later, Kale Brennan's name would be found in historical texts alongside the great magical innovators of the age. Not because he'd sought fame or recognition, but because his work had fundamentally altered how magic was understood and practiced. The comprehensive history of modern magical practice would devote 3 chapters to his discoveries, calling him the bridge between ancient and contemporary magical theory. Academic journals would debate his methods, his ethics, his legacy. Some would criticize his lack of formal credentials. Others would celebrate precisely that lack, arguing it freed him from constraints that limited institutional thinking. But in the gathering itself, in the satellite schools that carried forward his work, in the workshops and libraries filled with self-taught practitioners asking forbidden questions, there, Kale would be remembered more simply. as the man who proved that curiosity and determination could overcome any barrier to knowledge. That masters were optional when you possessed the courage to experiment and the humility to learn from failure. That the greatest discoveries often came from those willing to admit ignorance and explore anyway. The truth about old Mana had been his first great discovery, the achievement that changed the world. But his real legacy was simpler and more profound. He taught an entire generation that understanding was worth pursuing for its own sake, that questions mattered more than immediate answers, and that the greatest teachers were those who learned alongside their students rather than lecturing from unassailable heights. Without master, without support, Cale Brennan had unveiled truth. And in doing so, he'd created a future where others could do the same, asking their own forbidden questions, making their own discoveries, pushing into unknown territories with nothing but curiosity to guide them. The boy who'd once stood alone in a moorland, pressing his hand against humming stones and wondering about magic's deepest secrets, had ensured that no seeker would ever have to stand completely alone again. That more than any magical discovery was the truth worth preserving. O destino desta historia, esta nas suas mas. Se voca acredita que o heroi não esta sozinho, dix su like. Se voca vaio o que os outros não viram, escreva sua teoria nas comentários. E se voca precisa saber o que acontece a seguir, inscreva-se. O próximo capítulo vai mudar tudo.